So the state of democracy is not the issue. The issue is the stability.
As South Africa heads into its 2024 elections, the political landscape is more uncertain than ever.
However the elections turn out this year, I think we're going to see a more confused situation in South Africa than we've even seen in the past.
For 3 decades, the African National Congress has been the dominant force in South African politics, but it now faces the real possibility of losing its majority. President Cyril Ramaphosa and his party are grappling with widespread disillusionment and formidable opposition, potentially leading to a fractured coalition government.
The major structure of South Africa's democratic governance will hold. The issue is going to be, it could be a really fragile democracy with violence, with further economic decline, and it could just really be chaotic.
Will the ANC succeed in remaining in power in South Africa? What could this pivotal election mean for South Africa's democracy? And how would a shift in government impact the nation's ties with the United States, China, and Russia? This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, South Africa's election, democracy, and foreign policy outlook. Today, we're joined by Ambassador Charles A. Ray. Ambassador Ray is a member of the Board of Trustees and chair of the Africa Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and served as U.S. Ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia and the Republic of Zimbabwe. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020. For more information on this topic and more, visit our website by clicking on the link in the description.
Thank you. I'd like to start with the upcoming elections. They have been cited as being very consequential. Would you agree with that assessment? And if so, what makes them so important?
Well, yeah, I totally agree that the elections in South Africa this year will be extremely consequential, and primarily because this will mark the first election where the ANC risks not gaining a majority in the national elections. I mean, they've already in past elections been in a minority in the major cities and in some of the provinces where they've had to at the local level form coalitions with other parties. But it's looking more and more like this year they will have less than 50% of the national vote, and thus will be forced to go into some kind of coalition. And it could be with one of two parties depending on how they do, either the Democratic Alliance or the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is Julius Malima's breakaway group, which is even farther to the left than the ANC. So you could be looking at a completely different configuration of the political structure at the national level in South Africa. The ANC would still be in the driver's seat, but not. They wouldn't be the only people in the cockpit. They would have to consider coalition partners, which could create some disruptions. Create more disruptions than are already being created in South Africa with them now. The ANC is having to deal with splinters and frictions and splits within the party itself, and if they have to go into a coalition government, that just makes for more confusion. So I guess the bottom line is that however the elections turn out this year, I think we're going to see a more confused situation in South Africa than we've even seen in the past.
And thank you. And could you contextualize for us a little bit for those of us who don't have a good understanding of the politics of South Africa? How would you describe the ANC's appeal and the appeal of other political parties in South Africa? Are there certain demographic groups or regions or rules of thumb in terms of understanding the popularity and pull of different parties and why this might be happening now?
Well, I think in terms of demographics, the ANC tends to appeal to older voters and primarily those who live in rural areas. They're losing a lot of support in the urban areas and among the younger people, with appealing to the business community, who who have a totally different view of where South Africa should be going. The ANC's popularity is like a lot of the quote liberation parties in other countries in Africa. A lot of the older people tend to look back at these were the people who fought for their independence, who helped to bring them out of colonialism, or in the case of South Africa, out of apartheid. And so there's this sort of knee-jerk loyalty to the revolutionary liberation party on the part of older people, especially rural people and those probably with a lower level of education. Among the younger people, the a lot of the younger people who are frustrated at lack of jobs and at at just basically lack of economic opportunity, the perceived cronyism and corruption in the ANC and their economic mismanagement are actually seeming to drift more toward Malima's Economic Freedom Party, the EFF. And then among those older urban dwellers and people who have good jobs, sort of the middle class, if you will, they tend to drift toward the Democratic Alliance, and that's what creates this situation with them having to create a coalition. Is that you've got huge. Now the problem with the younger people is that there's a real issue with them almost opting out. I mean, there's a question as to how many of the young people or how many of the people who are sort of disaffected with or upset with the ANC's lack of performance, and there's a real danger that they'll just sit it out, which then really makes for some interesting statistics. It then becomes how many of the activist supporters of each party will they be able to actually get to the polls, and at the end of the day, they won't be counting the total voting eligible population, but they'll be counting the votes of the activists who actually come out and vote. And that's sort of the way you have a few other parties, but they're, like the Inkatha Freedom Party and what they call a Freedom First or Freedom Front Plus. And, they've never really done that well. And I don't really see them doing that well in the upcoming elections. I mean, the three parties I think that are going to be the deciding parties is the ANC, the Democratic Alliance, and the EFF. And I think the others, they might have single-digit percentage in the number of seats at the national level, but not enough to actually have a voice in affairs.
A lot has been made recently about the state of democracy in South Africa. Would you mind just taking some time and commenting on your perception of the state of South African democracy, how much faith the average South African has in the nation's democracy, and whether that even matters, and what are some of the largest challenges that are facing it right now?
Well, I don't think that democracy per se is in danger. I mean, even though the ANC has been sort of the dominant political party, when you talk about the representative governing in a country, it's not just the political parties or the executive that you have to look at. I mean, just for example, the South African military has been completely apolitical throughout, and I don't see them. I once predicted that the Zimbabwean military wouldn't step in, and I was wrong on that. But I think it's safe to say that the South African military, for all of its faults too, will stay out of politics. You have a completely, in my view, completely independent judiciary, which has often put the brakes on some of the more egregious actions of the executive. And so the executive is an issue. I don't really see it as being undemocratic. I can see it being democratic with one party trying to dominate, the others, but that's beginning to sort of fray at the edges with these the Democratic Alliance and EFF really moving up in support. So the state of democracy is not the issue. The issue is the stability. You have a like most countries in Africa, you have a huge percentage of the country are young people, and the young people throughout the continent are disaffected with lack of economic opportunity, with what they see as the refusal to let them be part of the system. That they don't really get a say in governing, and then of course the rolling blackouts in South Africa. This is supposed to be a country that had a great infrastructure, and they can't keep the lights going in places that's not good. I remember a trip that I made to Cape Town, and it's been over 10 years ago now, but I was staying in this beautiful, fancy, expensive hotel in Cape Town. I was there on official business, and I had a driver, and this driver is driving me around in this fancy hotel car, and he drove me past his ethnic he was in ethnic Indian, and he drove me past his house. He just pointed it out. He lived in what is in effect an Indian township, where he said, this is back in the like 2010, I guess 2010 or 11, uh, difficulty in getting potable water, electricity unreliable, very few paved streets, and so this contrast. And you have Cape Town that has some really upscale areas, and you don't have to drive very far to see slums, basically people living in abject poverty, and that's throughout the country, and that's a real issue. That's a legacy of a decision that was made in 94, when at the end of apartheid, the ANC, when it won the election, the decision was made to keep South Africa's macroeconomy solid, and to sort of table a lot of the microeconomic issues such as employment, youth employment, and in a conversation I had with a woman who was advisor to former President Zuma at the time, it created this demographic bubble that they well knew one day was liable to burst, and could, with disastrous consequences. And I have a feeling that depending on how this election turns out, we could start seeing little pops in that demographic bubble. You're going to see a lot of young people taking to the streets. If the situation, for example, in Zimbabwe keeps going bad, and a lot of Zimbabweans start moving into South Africa, as happened back in the 90s, you're going to get a large immigrant population, which is going to create frictions with locals on competing for jobs. There's already been issues in the last several years of anti-immigrant violence in South Africa and Johannesburg primarily. And so, while I think the major structure of South Africa's democratic governance will hold, the issue is going to be, it could be a really fragile democracy with violence, with further economic decline, and it could just really be chaotic. And hopefully wiser heads will prevail, and it won't get to that, but it could. And we cannot rule out the fact that South Africa could see widespread violence, and there's also the ethnic issue. I mean, Zuma's legal problems created some frictions between the various ethnic groups, because he's a different ethnic group than Ramaphosa, and that's always been sort of there in the background. There's the question of land redistribution, which is still an unresolved issue. You have a not a super large, but a significant white population that still controls a lot of the land. and other economic resources, and that's a sore point that has to someday be dealt with. And you know, it's those issues. I don't see South Africa becoming a military dictatorship, but I can see it being a completely fractious, chaotic democracy as it tries to wrestle. And it has, I mean, those are just internal issues, and then there's still the external issues that they have to deal with, and that's a whole other dynamic that will be shaped to a small degree, I think, by the outcome of the election.
Interesting. You mentioned some of the economic challenges, in particular, I think a lot of infrastructure rolling blackouts. What are, in your mind, some of the biggest economic challenges or the largest issues facing South Africa's economy at the moment? And you know, I'd like to dovetail over to foreign policy soon, and this might be a good way to kind of segue into that. You know, do those infrastructure needs feed into the foreign policy trajectory?
To a degree, they do, but before looking at the foreign policy issue in terms of economic development, it basically, as the dominant party that it from the beginning enjoyed almost unwavering support from the population. The ANC did a lot of navel gazing, and there's a lot of cronyism and corruption. I mean, let's just face it. I mean, there's an enormous amount of corruption in South Africa that can be traced to the ANC and to their cronies. Also, the crime issue. There's a I think in 2019 in South Africa there were over 20,000 murders, which was 3,000 more than it had been 5 years previously. I can remember Johannesburg when I first went to Zimbabwe. Johannesburg was considered the most dangerous city on the African continent, and so you have all these issues that are internal, that they have to fix their internal problems. The and how that feeds into the foreign policy issue is a thing that I don't think many Americans appreciate. The ANC hasn't changed. I mean, the ANC has always been a left-leaning liberation party, and it's never actually most members of the ANC, the political people, have never been that comfortable in dealing with the U.S., the EU, with the quote West, and I think there have been periods of quote détente where they weren't coming at us verbally, but they've never been comfortable with us, and they've never really totally liked us very much. And primarily that's because, the U.S., the UK, the West supported the apartheid government for the most part during the apartheid years because of quote the fear of communism, and because a lot of the liberation movements were supported by the Soviet Union. We forget these things; they don't, and they don't totally trust us to that. I'm not so sure they actually trust the Russians that much either, but the Russians at least were on their side during the liberation struggle, and that counts for a lot. And we shouldn't forget that. So you have this situation where South Africa now, the business community in South Africa is very pro-West because the business community recognizes that hitching their wagon to the Russian star is not going to that's not going to help their bottom line. I mean, the business community looks at it is more productive for them to deal with the EU, with the US, with the quote, Japan, than it is to deal with the Russians. Bring no economic benefits to them. The Chinese bring some, but probably not as much as they would still get from, say, dealing with the EU and with the US. And so that creates a tension there. You've got the political people in the ANC who are they lean toward the Russians. Russia was their ally, and Russia is also a member of BRICS, so they have some treaty obligations, and they tend to lean against us in a lot of things because they see us as leading a world order that does nothing for them, that does not respect their aspirations. And so, and that's no change. I mean, that's probably more out in the open since the Ukraine invasion, but it's always been there. I mean, anyone who thinks that South Africa's sort of leaning toward Russia and being somewhat anti-US is something new, I'm sorry, they haven't been paying attention. The ANC has never been pro-US. They've been neutral in some cases, but they've never been pro-US. They have always been pro-Russia. Well, they were pro-Soviet. I think it's rather interesting that they sided with Russia in the Ukraine thing, but most of the South African military and the students who studied in the Soviet Union during those days of the Soviet actually studied in Ukraine and were trained by the Ukrainians. But they see the Russians as the inheritor of the Soviet mantle that supported them. And so, that's an issue that I don't know how it's gonna shape out. The BRICS expansion, for example, and I'm working on a project now on how that's going to impact their relations with the West and their relations within Africa itself. And I'm sort of coming to the preliminary looking at figures, while the new expanded BRICS is a much larger economic entity. It contains some members who have some issues with each other. And so there's a real question as to how the expanded BRICS is actually going to operate in terms of competing with the US. The US, EU are still the dominant economies, along with Japan, South Korea. And so I don't know. I don't know where that's going. I don't think they know where that's going. And a lot of, a lot of the outcome is going to be how we react to what they do. And when we react in a way that reflects our lack of understanding of the history of South Africa. I mean, there are reasons for what they do. Don't say we have to agree with it. Don't say it's always in our best interest, but to react in a patronizing way when for example, when the South Africans do a joint military exercise with China and Russia, which actually didn't improve their military capability and didn't threaten us in any way. But when we react to it in sort of a patronizing, criticizing way, we simply reinforce their feeling that we look upon them as inferior and with disdain, and that's not how you get them on your side. I mean, if you're seen as looking down at them or lecturing them, you're not going to get them to, say yes. That's a sure way to get them to push back. That's a long, complicated answer, but it's a complicated situation. I mean, the domestic issues and the foreign policy issues are intertwined in a lot of ways, and then in a lot of ways they operate independently of each other. And on any given day, which one is more important will change depending on the circumstances and depending on what the external actors do. I mean, we have yet to see, for example, how the expanded BRICS is going to operate.
Thank you. And I have a lot of follow-up questions. When it comes to the BRICS, what is South Africa's role within the BRICS alliance, and how do you see that playing into how South Africa views its role on the global stage? I mean, they just brought this case to the International Court of Justice, for example. How does South Africa view its role within BRICS and within the larger global system?
Well, I think within BRICS, that's a good one, because I mean, South Africa was brought into BRICS long after it was established, and my own assessment of that was that this was BRICS, which was BRIC, bringing South Africa in was a way for Russia and China to sort of show that they cared more about Africa than the West did. I mean, they reached out to what at the time was the strongest economy in South Africa, and it made some sense. But there was also a political motivation to it, as this was Russia and China, and we often ignore the role India plays. That the U.S. led world order is not serving your interests, but we are looking out for you. So, and to the South Africans, that's great because they have seen them even during apartheid. South Africa saw itself as something of a kingmaker or a deal maker on the African continent, and so that attitude didn't change just because apartheid went and Mandela's party came in. They still see themselves as sort of the first among equals within AU and on the continent, and definitely in the Southern Africa region. And so by being in BRICS, they that sort of validates their credentials. This issue of the International Court, again, understanding history. One of the first foreigners that Nelson Mandela met with after his inauguration as president was Yasser Arafat, and the South Africans have been consistent in their support for the Palestinian cause, and we can't forget that Israel supported the apartheid regime just as we did for a long time. And there's always been tensions between South Africa and Israel over the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians. And so I think what the South Africans were hoping to achieve was to again just one, show their support for self-determination of the Palestinians, but also to be this was and this is just my assessment here. After the blowback for their neutral or their abstention on the Ukraine votes in the UN, which they still stood by, and in their context, it made sense. What they did is that they were basically saying, look, we're not going to take sides in this. But this was a way to sort of overcome that by going public with an issue that, again, we need to understand. A lot of the world agrees with them on this. And while maybe the biggest economies and the strongest countries are together, a lot of the so-called developing world agrees with South Africa on this issue, and by South Africa stepping up and going public, that raises their credibility with the rest of the global South or the developing world, and so South Africa is painting itself. I mean, even the Russians and the Chinese had to sort of, I imagine this caught them back-footed when the South Africans did this, and while they didn't do anything, I'm sure quietly, they cheered them on. This is raising South Africa's currency on the world stage, and I think in the long run, they'll benefit from it more than just be disadvantaged.
Thank you for that. Turning to Washington's relationship with South Africa, which you've touched on a bit, what is it in your mind? Well, one, how would you describe the relationship? And you mentioned it a little bit earlier. And as a follow-up to some of what you said prior, what are the implications of the U.S. not understanding the ANC?
Well, I mean, the implications are that it complicates our relationships with other countries on the continent. I mean, sometimes I think we fail to recognize that when we're dealing with one country, other countries are seeing this and they will respond to it. And on the African continent, when the issue after the what was it, the Africa U.S. Leader Summit back in December of 2022, I had conversations with a lot of people on the continent, some fairly senior government types. And there were a couple of things that didn't really get covered in the U.S. press, and didn't really seem to penetrate the administration. Is that while they were happy with it in general, there were some little issues that were not brought out in public. But for example, one person, I think it was a foreign minister, anyway, one of the senior people, sort of commented that they bust us around Washington and they take us into this room, and some American would get up to the front of the room and talk to us for a while, and then they would leave. And that's that tends to be seen as somewhat condescending. And I know it wasn't intended, but what you intend and how your audience reacts are two different things. And if your audience thinks you're being condescending, it really doesn't matter if you didn't intend to be. That's the outcome is the same. The other was, the conference, the meeting, the summit was supposed to focus on a number of things, and one of the things was increasing democracy on the continent. And one of the people invited, though, was one of the longest. And the reason he was invited was because the Chinese were trying to get a naval base in this country, and of course, the administration wanted to have an impact on that, and that's real politics. But you have to recognize that your actions sometimes speak louder than your words, and overshadow. And so if you say on the one hand you're doing something, but real politics causes you to sort of ignore it over here, other people are looking at that and they're coming to a totally different conclusion. Those are just minor things. Uh, some of the things that were promised out of that summit have been done. There have been probably more high-level visits to Africa by senior people in the administration, uh, than we've had in a long time. I mean, the Secretary of State's been, um, very senior people have gone, and so that's a plus. There have been some negotiations started on major business, economic and business initiatives, waiting to see how they shake out. Are they actually going to deliver on it? But beyond that, there's not really been much done. I mean, and people are still waiting. Okay, what? Let's see it on the ground, and that's a function of the fact that in Washington they can handle a crisis and a half at a time, and we've got Gaza and we've got Ukraine, and with this mess with the Houthis in Yemen, and now you're getting increased attacks in Iraq, and still have to worry about the North Koreans. Washington's bandwidth is pretty much exhausted, and so it's very easy to fall back into what I call the benign neglect of the continent. We come up with a program, we announce it, but then we're so busy on other crises that we don't really get to really do much. And you have, for example, a number of the embassies in Africa still don't have confirmed ambassadors. Okay. Uh, that's a signal that that's communicating whether we intend it or not. That's communicating something that we don't want to communicate. Um, and I don't blame the administration totally for that. Some of that is a problem with Congress. We have a totally dysfunctional Congress right now that can't seem to get its head out of. Um, but a lot of it is also, the administration is just so preoccupied with other things that it forgets or ignores that, and that complicates our relationship with South Africa. And South Africa is supposed to be a strategic partner. We make that announcement quite often, but then if you look at what we are actually doing, you look for that strategic partnership, it's hard to find. And so it's a complicated issue. It's complicated on their side. It's complicated on our side. And I think a lot of that complication is due to the fact that neither side fully understands the other and don't take the time to sit down and actually talk to rather than at each other.
Well, all very good points. I wish our administration had more bandwidth, but that seems to be the world that we live in.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. Voiceover host and editor for this episode is Casey Craig, with production support from Anthony Sipe and Brian Thong. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.